Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a screencast on the sit-in movement of the civil rights movement. I guess I shouldn't say movement twice, but we'll go with it. All right, so let's talk about the sit-ins. Our objective is to understand the movement and all of that we can learn from it, and of course, what it accomplished. So let's get started. So to understand the sit-ins, you really have to go back in time. Let's say to 1896, when the Supreme Court, this is a long time ago, decided that segregation was totally okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there was this court case called Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, and it said that the Southern practice of segregation, basically nicknamed the Jim Crow laws, laws that perpetuate segregation, totally okay. That they didn't violate the 14th Amendment to our Constitution. 14th Amendment says you have to treat everybody equally, but either way, the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson said you can separate people and still treat them equally, so therefore segregation doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. They were entirely wrong, and later on they would change their mind, but that is what they decided. So anyway, what are they talking about? Well, they were talking about segregation in schools, water fountains, buses, waiting rooms, parks, churches, stores. It was illegal to bring white and black people together. It wasn't even an option, right? So again, it's just awful. So it resulted in a world after 1896, particularly in the South, and under the federal government, where people were just completely segregated, and that meant that 80% of the world was denied to African Americans because they weren't allowed to enter white society. So anyway, but that was 1896, and that segregated society was created. But as of the 1950s, things started to change, and a fight was beginning to happen, leading to a revolution. And that fight kind of began with Brown v. Board of Education, another Supreme Court case. In this case, the same Supreme Court, about 50, 60 years later, different members, but same court, decided that segregation, at least in schools, was unfair to African American children, and it was unconstitutional. And that needed to change, and that really got African Americans ready to fight. They're like, "Yes, change is coming." And when you win something, you want to keep winning and keep fighting. And the Montgomery bus boycott, right around that same time, 1955, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and so many other African Americans fought to get rid of segregation of the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And a lot of people say that was the beginning of the civil rights movement and so on. Again, another fight against segregation, which won. And then the Little Rock Nine in 1957, basically a follow up to Brown. The Little Rock Nine were the first African American students to go to all previously white high school, and they're going to have to battle their way to survive there. And that's going to be important because they're going to win, and that's going to send a message to the entire South that schools did have to desegregate. So all of these battles and these wins are going to create hope. And when you have hope, that's going to inspire millions of people to hop into the fight, and that would be the civil rights movement. So that hope combined with anger over Emmett Till. Emmett Till, of course, in I believe 1955, inspired tons of anger with his lynching. He was from Chicago, and he went down to Mississippi and he got killed, lynched. And that anger, combined with the hope of those first few victories, will inspire lots of people to basically battle for the civil rights movement. And they had a little bit of direction from Gandhi because, of course, Gandhi was on the other side of the world right around this time, a little bit before, fighting against the British occupying of India, and and his methods are going to be adopted by the movement. So that said, this part of the civil rights movement is called the sit-in movement. Now, there were many battles, but this was just one of them, but this is important. So the sit-in movement is going to kind of launch in 1960. Its objective is going to be to take all these southern cities and eliminate segregation. No more whites here, blacks there. All this white property is off limits for people that are black. So when did this sit-in movement happen? 1960 it started. And there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of protests. And how did the movement start? Well, in 1960, in the state of North Carolina, in a place called Greensboro, right in the middle of the state, there's going to be 4 African American students that are going to sit down at a lunch counter. And it's going to be at this popular chain at that time called Woolworths. It's kind of a department store. And in that department store, there's a lunch counter where they feed people. And they're going to sit down and they're going to say, "Hey, I would like some food, please." And of course, under segregation law, they weren't allowed to feed them. They weren't allowed to serve them. And so normally when you're rejected, you go home and you're sad, but they knew this was coming. So they just refused to get up. And they stayed there and stayed there. Now, there have been sit-ins before, but none of them were overwhelmingly successful. And certainly none of them caught fire. And this sit-in is going to inspire dozens of hundreds of people to basically follow in their footsteps. And that's going to create change. And that's why this is so important. So anyway, the difference this time again was it attracted media attention, which the country was paying attention. And the idea catches fire, and there's going to be hundreds of sit-ins all over the South. And that's why this is super important. So either way, that Greensboro sit-in was the first one, and then of course there's going to be sit-ins in other places. And as you can see, over the next month, just hundreds or dozens of sit-ins across 69 cities, all to change segregation. So who was behind this? Well, it was predominantly African American students. Not that they didn't get the help of white students eventually, but predominantly African American and out of the South, because that's where Jim Crow laws and segregation was. And this is an example. It was actually these colleges that took on their cities, because social change is usually stemmed from young people, because old people have 2 or 3 jobs and they have kids and rent to pay and mortgages, and they often can't dedicate this amount of time to creating change. Young people, though, are less attached and they can take more risks. So that's why colleges kind of led the sit-in movement. Now, that said, we're going to look at a little bit of a case study. The sit-in movement's leader, even though it wasn't first, it was the sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee. So the primary target were lunch counters, the same as in Greensboro. Now, why? Well, because lunch counters were very visible and they gathered people's attention. And that's really, really important, because when you get people's attention, you have a chance to change their minds and grow your movement. You do not want to protest in isolation for a lot of reasons. Isolation. So anyway, the action they took was these students, literally these students in Nashville, sat down at a lunch counter that was previously whites only. And when they sat down, they ordered food. And that was what they did for the sit-in. Now, like in Greensboro, they were refused service, but they didn't leave. They waited. Now, why is this tactic effective? Number one, because that restaurant will not be making money if you're sitting in those seats. They can't serve people in your seats. And honestly, just that conflict alone will prevent other people from sitting down in the other seats. And that business is only there to make money, and now they're not making money. So maybe they're going to be like, well, maybe I'll change this policy so that I can make money. That's one thing. Now, the city is going to respond after the police are called. Okay, we'll arrest the African Americans that are sitting down. And the police are often called, and these same students get arrested. And what is the response of the protesters? Well, they go limp. They do not walk out to get arrested. They go limp so that it takes 2 or 4 police officers to carry them. That way, it takes a very, very long time for them all to get arrested. And, it takes longer than you think, because there's so many people that were sitting at those lunch counters. Now, it's an effective tactic because the police can't do their jobs if they're spending all day carrying people out. And that means their crime is rampant everywhere else. And that might entice the police to negotiate and be like, all right, fine, you can sit at these lunch counters. No more segregation. But finally, the police are victorious, right? They eventually clear the lunch counters. They arrest all of you. But then you send in the second wave of people, because you didn't just have 20 people, you had 40 people. And they now sit down. And the police are like, oh my God, that took forever to get rid of the first 20. Now I have to do these 20? So absolutely, they get mad, and it's not a big deal. They arrest them. Everybody goes limp, and it takes another hour or so. And then finally, they're cleared. And the police are happy, except they're not, because then the third wave sits down, then the fourth, then the fifth. And now you've got the police waiting all day just arresting people. And that store is all day not making money. And that's not a good thing. So the police and the stores are frustrated and they're upset, and maybe now's a good time to negotiate. But finally, again, those lunch counters might eventually be cleared if you arrest everybody. But then what would happen? Well, it's complicated. So those hundreds and hundreds of people get arraigned. That means charged with a crime. And you then get a chance to pay bail and get out of jail. So that's exactly what they would do. They would pay bail, get out of jail. And where would all those protesters go now that they've been arraigned and charged with a crime and paid bail? They go back to the restaurant and they sit down. And the police are like besides themselves. They're like, my God, what do I do now? So the store owner is just losing money. The police are busy. The courts are overwhelmed because they just keep arresting people and charging them with crimes. So now the courts don't even have time to arrest anybody else or to try anybody else. So it's a perfect time for negotiation. If you want the courts to function, the police to function, and the restaurants to make money, you better change the policy. See how effective this is? Nobody had to grab a gun to get what they wanted. They just used nonviolent civil disobedient protest. So why was this so effective? Well, let's go over that again. The main strategy of the sit-in is to get arrested, and of course they did get arrested, and lots of them. And why would anybody want to get arrested? Because number one, you attract media attention. There might be 200 people in your movement, but now everybody's seeing your movement and talking about it. And if they're talking about it, you might change their mind and get them to hop in. They might donate money, or they might actually use their bodies and come down and join in. And that is important, because otherwise everybody's busy. They don't care about your problems. So if you're going to change the world, you first have to get their attention. And that's what these arrests do. When hundreds of people get arrested, the television cameras come, the newspapers come, internet comes, and that's how you can spread your word. So again, you secure attention. That's absolutely the first step of civil disobedience. Get other people to pay attention so you can change their mind, and then they'll join your movement. Now, if they do join your movement, now you have extra people, more money, more participants, and that is power. And once you get to 51% of your area or your state or your country, you can now pass laws. And that's how you can change segregation, by passing laws to get rid of it. But you have to get people's attention so they can join your movement and you gain power. Another strategy of sit-ins is to get everybody arrested, which they did, and get everybody arraigned and charged. And then there's a strategy called jail, no bail. It even rhymes. And what they say is this time, don't bail yourselves out. Stay in prison, stay in jail. And if you can fill in the jails with your hundreds of people, the city won't have any more jail space. If they don't have any jail space, then guess what? The city can't actually, well, what my point is, if you fill up all their jails, they now have to buy food for you for every meal, pay for your medical expenses, pay for your heat, your protection. They have to take care of you. This is tens of thousands of dollars that they did not anticipate, and their budgets are overdone. In fact, the state, if you can't afford it, has to financially provide you attorneys, and those attorneys make so much money. So now you're just bankrupting them by putting hundreds of people in prison, and that's going to make the city lose money. And when they lose money, that's a good time for negotiation because they don't want to lose money. They're probably willing to change the law so they can keep their money. Now, another strategy for the sit-ins is to get everybody arrested, we know, and then arraigned and jail, no bail, and fill up the jails, right? And once the jails are filled, the city has no more room to arrest people. And if they can't arrest people, they are in trouble, right? Because then there's criminals everywhere, but what can they do? They don't have no place to put them. And that means the city is in trouble, right? They need to be able to put people in jail. So those criminals can't run wild, and the police would be helpless if the jails are filled. And that is a good time to negotiate so the police can get their jails back and arrest other people. Now, another strategy of sit-ins is to seek violence or court violence. What that means is you don't want to get violent yourself because you'll look like the bad guy and then nobody will join your movement. But if you put yourself in a position where other people will be violent with you, you'll look like a victim and the good guy and they'll look bad. And that's good for national attention because more people, if they see you as the good guy, will join your movement. So remember, the sit-in occurs and then you're inspiring the police, particularly the South of the time, to get brutal with you, and they're going to abuse you, and then the media is going to be there taking their pictures, and the South and the police are going to look terrible, and you're going to look like a good guy. Here's an example of a Nashville sit-in. The police definitely look like the bad guys here, right? And that will create hundreds of thousands of people to switch sides from supporting the police in the South to supporting you with all that media attention, right? Everybody pays attention, and now they join your side of the movement, which gives you power to change everything. Sorry about that. That's an announcement. And of course, if lots of people join your side, you can now pass laws if you get 51% to join you. Another strategy is to court violence, only this time not from the police, but local racists. Now, in addition to the police, the local people will show up because they don't want you to threaten their way of life. And they'll show up with their racist minds and they will get physically violent with you. And the pictures will be taken, and they'll be on video, and they'll be on the news after your sit-in. And when they verbally abuse you and when they beat you up, and here are some pictures in Nashville of people getting beat up. Watch this. They're pouring ketchup on them and mustard and sugar and so on. And here they are beating them up. Here you go. They're grabbing them. And then look at this violence, right? And people see that, and it attracts media attention, and the country pays attention and thinks they're bad and you're good, and that changes their mind, and they join your movement. And once again, this is a way to gain power in order to change new laws now that you have 51% of the country thinking you're right. So the most successful sit-in movement was in Nashville, even though they were everywhere. It's going to last for 3 months, and before it began, just a little history, there's a guy named Jim Lawson, and he's going to organize college students. Now, his objective is to do the sit-ins, right? So he holds workshops where he teaches them how to do successful sit-ins. Let me explain a little bit about this training. So there he is teaching these young people. He says, if you're going to go on a sit-in, you have to wear your Sunday best because you need to look professional and look like you're the good guy. Keep your eyes forward. When you make eye contact with somebody who hates you, that antagonizes them, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to look like the bad guy. No angry expressions, no matter what they do. If you have an angry expression and a picture that goes in the paper or on the news, you're going to look like the bad guy. No retaliation. They can hit you. Don't fight back because you're breaking the law. And if you turn violent, you're going to look like the bad guy and people are going to turn against you, not towards you. So again, they're even going to do drills where they practice on each other beating each other up, and they would. And Jim Lawson would say, if you can't handle this, you can't go on a sit-in. You'd actually have to get approved. So what do I mean? They would say racial slurs to them, and if that got you angry, you were out. And they'd pour ketchup on you. They'd spit on you. They'd slap you. They'd hit you. They'd tackle you. They'd punch your friend. And ultimately, if any of those got you angry, you weren't going to go on the sit-in. You had to prove that you could control your emotions. They taught you to go into your fetal position because that protects your head and your groin, your most vulnerable areas, right? So basically, so if you're getting beat up, go in that position. Protect each other. If somebody's taking a lot of hits, fall on top of them so that you take some hits. Another Nashville tactic was picketing. So in addition to the sit-ins, if you didn't want to do a sit-in, you would make some signs up and you would walk back and forth between segregated places. Now, you're not going. What this is going to do is it's going to be lots of people in front of a store, which is intimidating. So customers won't go in. That costs them money, and that they'll motivate them to negotiate out of segregation. Your signs that you're holding, people will read them, and they'll end up in the news. And now, without even speaking, you can express what you're upset about. People hear about that, they discuss it, they change to your side if they think you're the good guy. Now, what are the objectives of picketing? We just talked about it. It's an event, so it gets people's attention because it's on the news. You can spread ideas. People hear your ideas, right, with their signs, don't buy at Woolworth, things like that. Also, you can destroy the reputation of a company that segregates. Nobody really cared before, but now they do. And they're definitely don't want to be looked like the bad guy. And if people are doing sit-ins there and picketing, it's going to make them look like the bad guy. So just picketing will make them almost want to negotiate their way out of segregation. So segregation is morally wrong, things like that. You're going to scare customers away. We talked about that. Would you want to walk through this line right here? That's intimidating. So no, they're going to lose money. And that's a good way to negotiate out of segregation. Another Nashville tactic was boycotts. And what's a boycott? Well, a boycott is when you get a significant number of people to say that this group is wrong, these segregated restaurants and places, and we're not going to spend our money there anymore. We'll spend it somewhere else. And if you get hundreds of thousands of people refusing to spend money somewhere, they will lose a ton of money. And that's a good time to negotiate their way out of segregation. They'll be happy to get rid of segregation to make that money back. Now, what is the legacy of the sit-ins? It's true impact. Number one, in the Upper South, the hundreds of sit-ins actually got rid of segregation. Cities changed their laws, and they were successful. In the Lower South, Deep South, not so much. They really stuck to their guns, and they're going to take more aggressive protests to get those changes. Number two, the South used to have this myth. They're like, no, African Americans support segregation. They like it. It's only these northern African Americans that come down here and they're complaining. But those people are outside agitators like Dr. King, who's from Atlanta. He's not from our area. African Americans from our areas like segregation. They think it's great. But by all of these sit-ins and these thousands of African Americans doing these protests, it finally destroyed them. Because on the news, we saw thousands of African Americans going against segregation. So that's going to take one of the arguments out of the South, right? So that's it. Number three, the legacy of the sit-ins is it's going to split the civil rights movement. Sit-ins are going to be led by young students, and they're going to now say, look what we did. We got rid of segregation. And the NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization in the country's history, is too slow. It's led by old people. They take forever to get change done. So African Americans are going to start following the students rather than the NAACP a little bit. CORE is another organization, too old, and SCLC is Martin Luther King's too old and slow, too religious and passive. So the movement begins to split. And those young students aren't going to want to be treated as puppets by Martin Luther King. They're going to want to make their own decisions, have their own power. So again, the slogan of this young group of students was the people who do the work should be the ones to make the decisions. The students on the front line shouldn't have to follow Martin Luther King from far away. They can make their own decisions. So a new organization was created from all the leaders of the Nashville sit-ins, and it's going to be called SNCC, S-N-C-C. It stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC is going to have young people that are going to be willing to use more aggressive tactics to create change. And that's going to be very effective. John Lewis is going to be the first president of SNCC. So number four, legacy of the sit-ins is, again, still SNCC, and they're going to go down to Birmingham during the Freedom Rides, and they're going to help the Freedom Riders become successful. And the Freedom Riders are going to be a major step in the civil rights progress. So that's a big part of their legacy. Number five, civil rights movements, particularly the sit-ins, is going to build confidence and hope. The problem with losing so many civil rights battles is you think you'll never be able to create change, and people give up and they don't put their lives on the line for the movement. Who wants to put their lives on the line for something that's not going to change anything? But with the sit-ins, they had so many successes that African Americans gained hope. And they believe that they could actually create change, and it's going to inspire millions of people to take part in future civil rights protests, which is going to lead to success. It raised expectations. If they can win, we can win. We want to win. When people taste victory and equity, they want it all the more. Now, there's going to be this myth of impotence. That was the idea that African American protests just lose for decades. But now, with the sit-ins success, African Americans are going to feel, you know what, we can win this war. So let's bring the battle. And that's going to be important. And millions will be inspired. Now, what is the end game of all this? The passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Through all the different protests, not just the sit-ins, finally 51% of the country is going to believe that the South is wrong, African Americans are right, segregation is evil, and we're going to pass a law. Johnson's going to pass a law with all the pressure of this movement. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to ban segregation everywhere, not just at lunch counters and buses, but everywhere. And that is going to be the victory, that maybe the greatest victory Martin Luther King had, and so on. And certainly the students of the sit-in movement. All right, if you have any questions, obviously contact me, Mr. Fredericks, but thank you so much, and hopefully we have a greater understanding of the sit-in movement. Thank you.